The basic idea is that our talk, the first one, is going to be just setting up some of the, as the title says, conceptual issues that we have to deal with. I suppose in the background for a lot of what we do when we do it, right? And then, of course, we will focus on specific methodologies, where I'm hoping that by the end of the day we'll have a relatively clear idea of what they can do, what the problems with them are, and as I said before, how they can supplement each other. I don't know about everybody else in this room, but something that's really been a very sort of powerful impression that I've had for the last few years is that when you look at methodological issues in science, you really find out that, as a matter of fact, science isn't science. It's a craft, right? To sort of do ill justice to that stereotypical saying. A big part of learning how to do science is how to learn how to be a craftsman or craftsperson, right? But anyway, with regards to this particular talk, I wanted to start off with an old book. It's a book from the 18th century, the middle of the 18th century, 1745, The New Athens, written by Benedict Chmielowski. It's one of those Enlightenment encyclopedias. Right, now, Chmielowski wasn't Diderot, and his encyclopedia is not quite as good as the other one. So when he got to defining a horse, he had a bit of an issue and basically wrote, quite famously in Poland, what a horse is like, everybody can see. Right? The point being is that we know what horses are. Why would we be defining horses? And I suppose that, in a way, if you raise the question of what the hell are supernatural beliefs, our response is going to be similar. We know what supernatural is, right? We don't need to define it. We have an understanding of that, right? And also, we know what beliefs are. We don't need to define beliefs. Right? What a belief is like, everybody can see. And by the way, I won't have much more to say about beliefs. It'll be John that will be talking about beliefs, right? So I suppose one could turn around well and say, well, given that we have this great, wonderful understanding of beliefs and supernatural beliefs, we don't need to do any more work than that. We can just use our intuitive grasp. Right? We have a nice intuitive grasp of the concept, and we can use that because we know that intuitive grasp of the concept is never problematic, right? It's never vague, it's never context dependent, self-serving, or even just plain wrong, right? Well, yeah, about that, right? I mean, to take an example, here's a couple of rituals, right? And we know one of these is a time-honored religious tradition. And the other one is just ignorant superstition, right? How do we know that? Well, because one comes from our cultural background and the other one doesn't, right? It's a bit like that, isn't it, right? So much so that, in fact, it's fit for being turned into a rather ridiculous scene from an otherwise quite good 80s action comedy movie, right? All right, so the point being that while obviously a intuitive grasp of a concept is a starting point, really, to get beyond all kinds of problematic issues with that, we do have to have a concept which is a little bit more precise and which avoids exactly these kinds of issues. So, of course, the topic of what the hell supernatural beliefs are supposed to be is one that has been discussed for quite a while. Here's one gentleman who's discussed it, right? Scottish philosopher, David Hume, probably one of the greatest thinkers who ever lived, and definitely the person who is most capable of carrying off looking serious while wearing a nappy on his head, right? And of course, he talked about miracles as a violation of the laws of nature. Okay, so that settled it, right? If Hume thinks it, it must be right. There could be no further discussion about it, right? Well, there has been some further discussion about it. On Google Scholar, in fact, if you Google miracles in Hume, you get 44,800 entries. So, yeah, there's been quite a bit of discussion about it. Well, you'll pardon me if I don't go through all of that, but I just want to hit some of, well, one of the issues, right? If we talk about miracles, or more broadly, supernatural beliefs as being beliefs in violations of the laws of nature, then what are examples of the supernatural? I mean, is this an example of the supernatural? Right? This is a scene from Battlestar Galactica, and as in any other sci-fi movie or television show or whatever, if you look at it, there's lots of examples of them breaking the laws of nature. All right? So, are sci-fi movies in fact fantasy movies because they deal with the supernatural? That doesn't sound right. Right? And here's another example. Cold fusion. Is cold fusion supernatural because it breaks the laws of nature? Well, that doesn't sound right. And come to think of it, I mean, we know that Newton's laws of physics don't accurately describe laws of nature at high velocities. So, was this also an example of? No. Clearly, not all examples of violations of the laws of nature are going to be supernatural, right? Clearly, right? So, well, which ones? Well, these ones, like that. Hold on, wait, we're back to the intuitive grasp, right? So, it's problematic, right? To take another example, this is Paul Draper, who very wisely didn't try to one-up David Hume and did not put a nappy on his head. And of course he has, I think, a definition of what it means for something to be supernatural, which I think has a lot going for it, right? It comes in two steps. The first one, something is supernatural if it is not part of nature and can affect nature. You can see how there's a similarity there to Hume, of course. And something is, nature is the spatial-temporal universe of physical entities together with any entities that are ontologically or causally reducible to those entities. Well, again, lots of discussion to be had here, but I just want to point to one particular issue. What exactly do we mean by physical here? Right? Well, probably something like studied by physics, right? Something like that. Well, if you go that way, you end up fairly soon in something that looks a bit like this. On the one hand, you're saying that naturalist explanations are those used by science, And then on the other hand, you're saying that science is that which uses naturalist explanations, which tends to be a rather tight little circle, which doesn't really enlighten us too much, right? So, what are we to make of this? I think the way to approach this whole issue of what is the concept of supernatural beliefs is via something that another physicist, Niels Bohr, once famously said. This is what Niels Bohr has lots of interesting, shall we say, quotes. This is the one that I'm rather fond of, which is every sentence I utter must be understood not as an affirmation, but as a question. All right, so how does that apply to concepts in general, specifically concept of supernatural beliefs? Right? The idea is that, I mean, in philosophy, it often is treated, concepts are treated as, definitions are treated as the start. You have to have a very clear-cut definition, otherwise you're not going anywhere. And actually quite often in philosophy that also seems to be the end, right, when you read a lot of philosophical articles. Here, the approach is quite different, because you're really thinking about concepts as a kind of hypothesis, a kind of a tool that you want to use in your thinking about the phenomena that you're studying, right? What do I mean by that? Well, here's a bunch of entities. If you are using a concept which picks out some subset of those entities, what you're in fact saying is that what you have is a bunch of entities that it is in some sense useful to set apart. Right? You're making that claim. And why? Well, because, to use, philosophical realist language, it cuts nature at its joints. There's something important about that distinction in reality that picks out that set of entities. So that in fact, that helps us to have some sort of insight into the phenomena that we're studying. Right? So all those definitions that Paul Draper and David Hume had, we should think of as hypotheses, that this is the set of objects that it's useful to set apart. Right? And of course, hypotheses don't have to be true to be useful. They have to get us forward in our investigations. Right? But on the other hand, that seems like a lot of work and difficult, and why the hell should we bother? Right? I mean, if you think about it, what does science do? Science very much tends to keep making ever finer distinctions, right? So perhaps we don't need to talk about supernatural beliefs. Perhaps it's enough that we talk about just individual examples and don't worry about how all of that fits together. Well, my first worry, if that's true, is what the hell are we all doing here in the same room? Right? We study quite often different beliefs that we believe they have something in common, which is why it's worth coming together and talking to each other. Right? So, I mean, sorry to use a very old and hackneyed story, but really it's like that bunch of people where one person is feeling around and he feels something that feels like a wall, and another one feels something that feels like a fan, another one a column, and another one something that feels like a snake, right? The question being, are we looking at an elephant here? Right? Of course. Right? So, where does it take us? Well, I mean, one thing we can do is we can sort of try and out-Dawkins, right? We can out-Dawkins and say, well, is there such a thing as supernatural beliefs? Right? Never mind if the supernatural exists, the supernatural beliefs exist. And of course, you know, we have examples of work which is kind of like that. Neil van Leuven, of course, argues that we don't have supernatural beliefs. He argues we have, what's his term again?
Credences.
Sorry?
Credences.
Credences, that's right, thank you, right? He talks about credences. By the way, this photo of Neil van Leuven, you're probably wondering why I had a photo of him with a wombat. Well, the problem with all the other photos of him, they don't have a wombat in them, so I had to use this one. Right, so that's what Neil van Leuven talks about, but that's different, right? He's not talking about whether the category in general makes sense, it's whether how we should think about a category, right? So really, we're much more in the sort of territory that you get with Pascal Boyer and what he says about religion, right? Is there such a thing as religion? Is there such a thing as supernatural beliefs? And of course, Pascal tends to be rather skeptical, but that's not the attitude that I would suggest to us. I would suggest a somewhat different attitude. One of the fields of study in psychology, that I've looked at some length is judgment and decision making. Right? And something that I find absolutely amazingly annoying in that field is that what you get is a researcher will develop a methodology, and they will develop a low-level theory which explains the results they get from that methodology, and they will publish. Right? And then 50 miles down the road, there will be another researcher who has developed a somewhat different methodology and a somewhat different low-level theory, and they're also publishing like mad. And you look at their work and you go, well, clearly these things are connected to each other. But nobody seems to be doing any work to really connect that stuff together. Right? Of course, partly because that's just often very, very difficult. Right? The point being that science isn't just about analysis. It isn't just about breaking things apart. It's also about bringing things together. I suppose in the way that we're brought together in this room with our different approaches and I suppose also different theoretical backgrounds. Right? So the position that I suppose I'm sort of leading towards is what could be half seriously called something like methodological questing agnosticism with regards to the existence of supernatural beliefs. Right? We don't know if there definitely is a useful category which is called supernatural beliefs, to be called supernatural beliefs, but it seems very useful to think that there is one and try and see if there is one. Right? All right, so I had problems, I had issues with those definitions, and as I was preparing this talk, I saw this cartoon, which I think covers very nicely some of what's happening here, which is, for those of you who can't read it, every social science text introduction, and then on it says, continued disagreement about the definition of what we're all talking about has continued to hinder progress. For the sake of this work, I will create a new one. Well, I won't quite go that way, right? But I just want to point out something that is lacking in those definitions that we saw, that I think is key. And that this meeting, I think, really is, to a great degree, all about. Right? Because what you get is a lot of discussion and thinking about what the supernatural beliefs are, but there is very little discussion about how they are produced, right? And a lot of us here have connections to cognitive science and religion, and of course that's what cognitive science and religion is all about. It's trying to work out what mechanisms are that produce those beliefs. And in the context of perhaps comparing supernatural beliefs to ones that are not supernatural, right? Well, it's not a straightforward distinction to be drawn. It's a distinction between the processes, the differences in the process that produce those beliefs, right? The social and cognitive processes that lead to, on the one hand, supernatural beliefs, and that in other situations with different social context primarily can lead to, in fact, scientific beliefs, right? What Paul Draper is all about. And that's all for me. John.
All right, so Konrad was worried about a level of precision about the supernatural half of the term supernatural beliefs. I'm going to worry about the second half.
Because one issue is not enough.
Yeah,
right?
quite, exactly. And you know, the issues are not that dissimilar. Just by the way, how many of you are philosophers? Right. Okay, right. And so that's a relief. Okay, so this is the belief part, right? Roughly speaking, you can take, I think, two stances towards beliefs as a category, or belief as an object, say. The first is to be realist about them, which is to say that beliefs are objects of a sort worthy of inclusion in our scientific theorizing, and we'll get to what sorts of objects they might be in a moment. And the second is to be, well, the opposite, anti-realist about them, which is to say that there are no beliefs. The beliefs are not things. And talk of beliefs might be, for example, a convenient way of talking about something else. So if you are, for example, a sort of radical behaviorist, you might say that beliefs really just are behavioral disposition. So there's no kind of like, there's no reality to beliefs per se, that what they are is a convenient way of talking about patterns of behavior. If you are a kind of neuroscientific eliminativist, you might say that beliefs are really just patterns of neurological behavior, right? Neurophysiological activity. In both cases, the idea is that one day, psychological scientists will stop talking about beliefs altogether, in the same way that we have stopped talking about phlogiston, or ether, or souls. To nail my colors to the mast, I'm going to take a realist position for this talk, though I don't really think that this position is obviously true or obviously justified. It is for convenience, if you like, that I'm taking a realist position in this talk. If you happen to be a realist about belief and think that beliefs exist in some sense, then the next obvious question is, what are they? And here also there are, roughly speaking, two options. The first is to be a representationalist and say that belief is a kind of cognitive representation. Of course, there are many kinds of cognitive representations, so we might have to be more specific. Some cognitive representations are propositional, which mostly just means that they are structured in such a way that they can be used in the making of inferences. And one way of thinking about this is that they can be translated into meaningful sentences in whatever language, for example, English. But some cognitive representations are non-propositional. The classic example is images. being the paradigmatic case. So if you close your eyes and you imagine something, we think that that's a cognitive representation of a sort, but that's obviously not propositional because it can't be expressed in a sentence, as it were. It's a picture. But cognitive associations might count as non-propositional cognitive representations as well. So those of you who are involved in work on implicit attitudes, for example, might theorize that what we're measuring when we're measuring implicit attitudes is not really a propositional belief, but a kind of association. So those would be non-propositional cognitive representations. There seems to be a subtle but important difference between, for example, associating, say, the concept God with the concept imaginary, and believing that the sentence God is imaginary expresses a true proposition. And that's the kind of difference that I'm talking about when I talk about the difference between a propositional attitude and a non-propositional attitude. But it's possible that that difference between an association and a proposition is more apparent than real. The second broad option is to be a dispositionalist. Some people think of dispositionalism as a kind of anti-realism, but I think it could be a bit more agnostic about the reality of beliefs than anti-realist here by being a dispositionalist. So dispositionalists define belief in terms of a disposition, you'll not be surprised to hear, to feel or act or think in certain ways. And therefore they think of beliefs a bit like the way that a lot of personality psychologists think about personality traits, which are not kind of like cognitive representations themselves, but as a kind of disposition, for example, to produce particular kinds of representations. Now, exactly what comprises the relevant disposition is up for grabs among even dispositionalists themselves, and a matter of disagreement among these theorists. So, but never mind that for now. Again, to nail my colors to the mast, I mostly think that beliefs are a type of propositionally structured cognitive representation. I resist the idea that beliefs are composite dispositions, in part because on that view, the belief-behavior correlation is tautologous, right? So if you say that, what it means to believe what it means to believe that P involves a behavioral disposition to behave in P-like ways, then it's not interesting to discover that people who believe in P behave in P-like ways, right? That's just part of your definition of the belief in the first place. It kind of robs the scientist of interestingness of empirical work, having defined all of this into reality. In contrast, I think that it's a perfectly reasonable, testable, empirical hypothesis whether believing that P leads to behaving as if P. Whereas, as I say, on the dispositionalist account, that's not really a hypothesis. That's just an analytic truth given your definition. Right. So I have the different sort of subgenres of representationalism and disposition there. Okay. So representationalism about beliefs gives rise to a particular way of thinking about various characteristics of beliefs, and in particular of what makes particular cognitive representations a belief as opposed to some other kind of cognitive representation, say an imagining or a delusion or whatever, right? Right. You can imagine various kinds of cognitive representations that are not beliefs. So the two examples I gave you, imagining and delusions, are kind of more or less classic examples. But another one you might think of is hope, right? So to believe that P is a different kind of attitude than to hope that P. So we argue. And the question is, well, how do you distinguish between these different kinds of attitudes, right? So first there are input considerations. Two commonly proposed input considerations are evidential sensitivity and the lack of volitional control. That is to say that beliefs, and perhaps not other cognitive representations, are kind of not amenable to volitional control. You can't just will yourself to believe something, right? So that's one option that gets theorized about. We can't just decide to believe stuff. And closely related is that beliefs are sort of automatically responsive to evidence or argument. They're sort of automatically updated as new information arises. So some people focus on these, right? Some people who say the difference between a belief and hoping or imagination is that they differ on these two kinds of dimensions. But within this conversation, there is some theoretical diversity. So some theorists might allow beliefs to be amenable to indirect volitional control, so that people can actively do something to change their beliefs, even though they cannot change their beliefs directly just by saying, I'm going to believe something else right now. And also theorists differ on exactly how evidentially sensitive beliefs are, or even what counts as evidence, such that when you're confronted with evidence, then your beliefs automatically update. And then there are also some output considerations, right? So two commonly proposed are roles played by beliefs in either the generation of inferences or the production of behavior, right? So the first is probably somewhat less controversial than the second, and it's meant to rule out things like images and mere associations, neither of which can play an inferential role because they're not propositionally structured. Whatever those things are, they're not beliefs. As I say, because they don't play this kind of inferential role. The second is trickier. The behavioral role is trickier. On one hand, we do generally expect people to believe in accordance to their beliefs, to behave in accordance to their beliefs, at least in the presence of the relevant desires and opportunities. On the other hand, I don't think it's absurd that some beliefs might never be acted on, so they just kind of live in your head and you never really behave in accordance with your belief, either because there's never an opportunity to do so or because you lack the desire to act on your beliefs kind of entirely. Finally, there are what you might call sort of phenomenological considerations. So some people think that beliefs feel different from other cognitive representations in a way that's a little bit difficult to quantify. So David Hume, whom we've seen earlier wearing a nappy on his head, suggested that beliefs have a kind of vivacity that other mental states lack. He's not at all clear about what vivacity means or how to measure it. So I'm not sure how helpful that is, really. So some theorists, though, turn that kind of on its head, the other way around, and say that it's other propositionally structured cognitive attitudes, like, for example, hope, that are interestingly different from beliefs, in that, for example, they might contain an element of desire, like imbued into the kind of propositional attitude, and beliefs lack that. So rather than trying to characterize what beliefs feel like, some theorists try to characterize what other things feel like, and then by elimination, the things that are left over are beliefy. More commonly these days, some people think that beliefs just have to be consciously endorsed by the believer to count as a belief. So whatever the propositional attitude is, if you ask the agent and they say, yes, I believe that, then that's what counts as a belief. That's not uncontroversial, but it is not a not uncommon view among philosophers who think about what the nature of belief might be. As I've been hinting at, one way to think about all these characteristics is to consider how they might distinguish between different kinds of cognitive representation or attitude. So imagining might differ from the belief. Imagining might I'll leave that up there. You'll see a bunch of like red circles. You can ignore them for a moment. Imagining might differ from belief in that it is under volitional control, right? So we can, if we wanted to, at will, imagine that God exists without believing that God exists, right? So, and closely related to imagining. In fact, I think kind of identical to imagining in certain ways, is assuming for the sake of argument, right? Or assuming as a hypothesis to be tested, for example, right? So we can assume for the sake of argument that God exists without believing that God exists, and the difference, arguably, is one of volitional control, right? You can choose to assume for the sake of argument that God exists without believing that God exists, which is a thing that you can't just control by sheer force of will. Now, of course, some people say that religious belief is precisely the maintenance of belief out of sheer bloody-mindedness in the teeth of evidence. But maybe this is wrong, right? So maybe so-called religious belief, sort of isn't belief at all in that sense, but a kind of imagining or assuming for the sake of argument, if it's the case that you can kind of will yourself to believe in supernatural entities. In contrast to these input conditions, evidential sensitivity and volitional control, the output conditions don't really distinguish between believing and imagining, right? So when we do something like assume that P is true for the sake of argument, we are doing so, as the name suggests, to perform some inferential reasoning. So it seems like we can assume for the sake of argument that P and use that in a way that some people suggest beliefs are used, which is in making inferences. And similarly, when we imagine in the context of pretend play, we are precisely coming up with a cognitive representation that guides our behaviors, right? So it seems that an inferential role and a behavioral role does not set imaginings and beliefs apart from one another, and in that sense are less useful criteria for demarcating between beliefs as a kind of cognitive attitude versus other kinds of cognitive attitudes. However, these output conditions, so the role in inference and behavior, might be able to distinguish between beliefs and other kinds of propositional attitudes. And the example that most people give in this case are the monothematic delusions that you see kind of on the screen above, like Capgras and Cottard's delusions. So the clinical literature suggests that seemingly sincere affirmations of certain kinds of beliefs describable under Capgras and Cottard's are somehow detached from these particular outputs, which is to say the outputs about making inferences and behaving accordingly. So for example, Capgras patients will seem to totally genuinely and honestly claim that their spouses have been replaced by doppelgangers, right? But they will fail to make the appropriate inferences and fail to behave accordingly. So they might tell their psychiatrist, my wife has been replaced by a space alien, but they will nevertheless be happy to share a bed with this doppelganger, right? Without seemingly worrying too much about that, right? They seem emotionally detached from this, right? Otherwise quite radical claim. Similarly, Cottard's patients will seem to honestly and genuinely claim that they are in fact dead themselves, but then fail to make the appropriate inferences and behave accordingly. So for example, they will claim to the psychiatrist that they're dead, but upon some reflection, that behavior doesn't make any sense, because if you are dead, then your psychiatrist presumably won't be able to understand you talking. So, and obviously you are talking, so clearly you can't be dead, because you would think that dead people can't talk. But they don't seem to fill in the syllogism, right? So they'll agree that, Cottard's patients will agree that dead people can't talk, and that they can talk, but they will assert that they're dead. But that really doesn't make sense, so logically, right? But they seem to affirm the belief quite sincerely, and yet they can't use that belief in rational inference. So maybe delusions aren't beliefs, right? If they differ from normal beliefs, let's say, in these sorts of ways. Relevant for our interests in this room today is that some people think this about religious beliefs, that religious beliefs are also not kind of used as a matter of course in making inferences, and in particular in making practical inferences. So this is kind of Neil van Leuven's view, right? That people say that they believe in God or whatever, but given that the belief in God is not generally speaking used in making practical decisions or any other kind of inference, then maybe they're not really beliefs, that maybe they're a bit more like delusions in that sense. They're kind of representation that's detached from the rest of our kind of nomological network in our minds. So religious people seem to honestly claim that God is omnipresent and that God cares about our moral behavior, but nevertheless, lots of religious people act in abjectly immoral ways, for example. Okay. So finally, the obvious thing to say about conscious endorsement, the middle term under phenomenology, is that if you think that conscious endorsement is a necessary condition to make a cognitive representation a belief, then obviously implicit beliefs don't count as beliefs, right? To the extent that you can't or won't or don't consciously endorse your implicit beliefs. Okay, so lots of kind of circles. As it happens, I don't really have a view on the specifics of this and how all these kinds of different mental states might fit together. But I am currently running a project that explores different accounts of beliefs. And this is in part in conjunction with Neil Van Leuven and also Tanya Lombroso at Princeton. We will soon hopefully produce an edited volume where we basically invited a bunch of philosophers to theorize about what beliefs might be. And then, then we can maybe work out whether or not any of these definitions of belief are in fact empirically testable, whether or not they could count as a kind of scientific theory. I think one of the things that Konrad and I share in common is we want to encourage researchers to think about some of our conceptual tools like definitions, but also, as you'll see later on in my next talk, even our assumptions about our measurements. I think we both want to encourage us all to think about them as scientific theories, which are amenable to hypothesis testing and data collection, rather than just kind of these platonic background assumptions that we must never touch. So watch this space for work coming out on what beliefs might be. Okay, so if I would try to say something, if I were to try to say something about a consensus in the field among philosophers, I think it looks something like this, right? I think most people are representationalists about beliefs, and that they are also propositionalists about the kind of representations in question. I think that most theorists are happy with the idea that beliefs are not amenable to volitional control. So there are some people who think that you can will yourself into believing, but they are few and far between. And I guess I do think that most people want to say that there's some kind of role in behavior and inference that beliefs play. And what this picture, right, of belief does for theorists is to rule out imagining and delusions, and it might include implicit beliefs by kicking out the kind of phenomenological trait. The jury is still out on whether or not religious beliefs count as beliefs under this scheme. Okay, so in my next talk, directly after this one, I will say much more about measurement, but it's worth laying down some very basic groundwork here, I think. Just as there are two ontological views on mental states, one realist and the other anti-realist, so there are also two approaches to measurement, one realist and the other non-realist. The term operationalize you might already be familiar with if you are a psychologist, because you might yourself have asked at conferences annoying questions like, how do you operationalize that? So that's where this term comes from. If you're a philosopher in the room, that's the psychologist version of how do you define that, right? To us, these are not that different to one another. So operationism or operationalism, depending on who you ask, is the view that a measure is just what, a measure kind of measures what it measures, right? It's a kind of tautological view that there's no kind of thing that's being measured. The thing is just the thing that's being measured. A contrast with realism might help, because that was a very kind of confusing locution. On a realist view, there is something called a construct, right? Like a kind of invisible hypothetical entity in our minds, and this construct is the thing that's being indicated by the measure, right? In contrast, on the operationalist view, there is no kind of underlying hypothetical entity called the construct. The construct is just a summary of the indicator, right? And I'll get into that in more specifics sort of later on. One sort of classic example which we'll return to is IQ. On the orthodox view among intelligence researchers, which is not to say that it's the correct view, I just mean it's the most common view among people who study intelligence. An IQ test is a measure of something called intelligence, right, which is theorized about in some way, and is a latent construct, so we say. And indeed, that different measures of IQ nevertheless measure the same thing, the same underlying construct. Intelligence. For example, the Wechsler's test and the Stanford-Binet test and the Raven's progressive matrices might all measure the same thing, albeit in slightly different ways, right? So the Wechsler's test comprises 10 core subtests and 5 supplemental subtests, of which from which 4 scores can be computed: verbal comprehension, perceptual reasoning, working memory, and processing speed. And these can be further summarized in 2 ways. The general ability index, they say, only covers verbal comprehension and perceptual reasoning, whereas the full-scale IQ covers all 4 areas of the Wechsler's test. Similarly, the Stanford-Binet test includes 10 tests, which cover fluid reasoning, knowledge, quantitative reasoning, visual spatial processing, and working memory. So there's some, but not complete overlap with the Wechsler's test. And then in stark contrast, the Raven's progressive matrices are entirely nonverbal. They're basically a series of like patterns, and then you have to fill in like what you think comes in last, right? And so it focuses on fluid intelligence. But despite the different focuses of all three tests, intelligence researchers argue that they're all measuring the same underlying thing, right? Which they call general intelligence, or G for short. Right. So what you can do if you believe this idea, right, is to extract the G part of all three tests, the sort of Weiss, the Stanford-Binet test, and the Raven's matrices, and then you can work out whether or not the G loading, they say, is similar across the tests, or whether they measure the same thing, etc. This is a quite difficult thing to do because obviously it requires the same subject to do all the tests, right? And they each take like hours. So like, you know, you couldn't pay people enough to like do 3 IQ tests back to back, basically. But it has been done, right? So people have done this kind of thing. Not, as it turns out, not with these 3 tests specifically, but with other sets of IQ tests. And you know, like people generally find that the latent variable score, the G score, across the tests do tend to be highly correlated with one another. So the argument there is that therefore there must be something going on underlying these measurements, which again people call G. And if you take a realist view, then you think that, you know, there's a thing in your head, right, that you can describe as general intelligence, which you might characterize in some way. So we'll get to some of this later on as well. This is just by way of saying that that when we think about what it means for a measure to be valid, what we're doing is we're usually assuming some kind of causal model at the back of our minds, where the construct is caused by some factors and then leads to some outcomes. And what we're doing when we're validating a measure is to work out whether or not our measure captures this causal pattern. Right, so for example, if you're trying to validate an intelligence measure, you might see whether or not the intelligence measure in question correlates with various sort of genetic traits that you might expect given your theory, and also whether or not it then goes to predict downstream effects, again, according to your theory, and then that's how you sort of validate a measure of any kind, but here in particular an intelligence measure. So similarly, we might have the same idea about our measures of supernatural belief, that when we're trying to validate our measures of supernatural belief, we usually have a kind of causal model in mind, which may or may not be this simple, but that's really the thing that we're testing, or rather the thing that we're assuming when we're validating measures. I have a slide on reliability, but I'm going to skip that for now because I'll say much more about this in my next talk. Right, so everything I've said about intelligence so far, which I'll pick up more on later on, can be said about supernatural belief or belief of any other kind, right? So the realist view of mental states and traits, including of belief, including of supernatural belief, is, as I was saying earlier, itself a testable scientific theory. Now, all this might seem very tedious and onerous. As Konrad asked earlier, like why do we bother kind of like thinking so kind of like deeply about our definitions and our measures? You might wonder, for example, why we might bother being realists about mental states and other constructs, and that's a good question, I think. We could just be agnostic about what we're measuring, for example, or we could just bite the sort of anti-realist or behaviorist bullet and say that all we're measuring is responses to questionnaires as opposed to actual mental states like beliefs. But I think most scientists are dissatisfied, right, with the kind of like pragmatist and anti-realist view here. On the whole, I think that that scientists do tend to think that we're trying to measure something real, right? Now, we don't think very hard about that, admittedly, but I do think that that's our inclination, is to think that we are measuring something in the world, as opposed to just kind of measuring the thing that we're measuring by definition. So I'm going to say more about this later. I'm not really trying to persuade you to be a realist about these things, but I do think that to the extent that we're intuitive realists, I think we should interrogate our intuitive realism about mental states, especially if we want to remain being realists about mental states. I want us at least to be clear about what our realism entails for our measurement practices, for example, and our other kind of research activities. And then if we want to abandon realism, I want us to think more clearly about what abandoning scientific realism about mental states entails for our theorizing, for example. Like I don't think it will do to just kind of pretend that these aren't real problems, right? That these aren't questions that are worth considering. Thank you.
Okay, now, because this is getting streamed, we actually have, is this on?
Not yet.
Not yet?
No.
Right, because this is getting streamed, we actually have a microphone. So perhaps, yes, Sylvia. There we go. Oh, okay. In that case, Robin, can you walk around and, yeah, so that the people on the internet can actually hear the questions. Yeah.
Okay. Does it work?
Yep. John, I need an example of a complex belief where people consistently act in alignment with that belief. Like, what are those beliefs? So if we're if we're saying that belief in God is not one of these things, what is one of these things? Because I can't think of one.
So I mean, the operative term there is complex, right? And in some ways, that's the problem. So I mean, Neil Van Leuven's favorite example is not a complex example. And you'll see this in my second talk, which is his example is the belief that there's milk in the fridge, right? And coupled with the relevant desires, your belief that there's milk in the fridge leads to quite reliable behaviors, like asserting that there's milk in the fridge or going to the fridge for milk, etc. But it is true, and you'll see some of this in my next talk as well. Is that, like, in general, psychologists are not interested in beliefs like that. Right?
Yeah, so I mean, that strikes me as just carving off belief to be this very narrow band of just practical behavioral things, rather than the sort of stuff that is interesting. Like, I mean, I'm not that like understanding basic behavior, like there's, I have a bunch of neuroscience people in my department who study that, and it's great and interesting, but like, I'm not, that kind of cleaving belief that way just means we have this huge area of things that are no longer beliefs. Like,
yeah, no, indeed. I mean, so Neil bites that bullet, right? I mean, so what Neil would say about this is to say, look, like, for a long time, psychologists focus on things that they call beliefs, which A, aren't really beliefs, and B, actually represent the minority of things that are beliefy, whereas, like, we seem to be bored by the milk in the fridge examples. But if you are like a memory theorist or a perceptual psychologist, you will find those things very, very interesting, right? Like, and so in some ways, he's trying to push back against our focus on what he would call, like, exotic belief type things.
Is that just like the people he's associating with? Because I'm pretty sure there are more perceptual theorists than people who study religion and psychology by, like, an order of magnitude.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly possible. But, like, I think he want to argue that what we do, like, within a kind of like 24-hour period, is do more believing of the boring kind, right, than believing of the exotic kind, right? So this would be kind of his way of thinking about the difference between the boring and the exotic, where religious beliefs, political beliefs, social beliefs, beliefs about yourself are in that sense exotic. Whereas when we're navigating around the world, most of the time we are relying on the kind of mental representations that you and I might think of as quite boring. But just because we find them boring, so I think he thinks it's a mistake that we find them boring, because the vast majority of what we do, he would argue, relies on these boring mental states, the kind of mental states that do reliably guide our behavior, etc. I mean, as I'll say later on in my second talk as well, I mean, there's a sense in which like psychologists don't measure beliefs. We measure a kind of disposition to say certain things or behave in certain ways, etc. There's a sense in which psychologists kind of behave like dispositionalists, right? And I have an argument about why I think that we behave like this, as you'll see later on. I don't know whether we should, right? But like I think kind of the point is, to think about, well, wait a second, what are these constructs that we're interested in, right? Like, are they best described as beliefs? And if not, then how should we describe the constructs that we're interested in? Maybe you are interested in things that are a bit more like personality traits than like beliefs. I mean, it's not for nothing that, skip the religious beliefs for a moment. I mean, famously, the attitude-behavior correlation is like 0.2 or something, right? And like loads of people have theorized about why the explicit attitude-behavior correlation is so low. And most people who theorize about this think that it's something to do with like the lack of motivation, right, or the lack of opportunity, or the lack of desire, or something like that. And to the extent that the relationship is not monotonic and not like unilateral, then it seems obvious that to produce behaviors, your attitudes must come with a set of like desires and sort of contextual variables, and that explains why the correlation is low. Rather than saying that there's actually just a straightforwardly weak relationship between the belief and the behavior, is to say that actually, in the presence of the relevant desires and the relevant contextual variables, the relationship is quite strong. But like, it's not clear that that's a testable hypothesis, right? That's a kind of like assumption that we're making about this.
Okay, one more thing, and then I'll give this. So, I mean, I think we can query this room. How many people here thought that like milk in the fridge and religious beliefs were the same category of thing, like before this talk? I mean, I'm wondering, I understand the kind of the project to look at what we are actually measuring, but I don't, like, is it or is it not a belief? It just seems like we're just cleaving something off and saying, well, these are beliefs now, and then we no longer have a word for the rest of this stuff, but we already knew that they weren't the same thing.
So I don't know if that's true, but so that's an interesting question, right? So I think lots of religious people and lots of anti-religious people do think that the propositions God exists and like Saturn exists are similar kinds of propositions. They express like, an object, Saturn, God, and the object is associated with a trait such that the trait is attached to the object. So exists being the trait in question. But Saturn is an exotic example. You can say tables exist, right? So I think like lots of religious people and lots of critics of religious people think that when people say God exists, they mean more or less the same thing, the same kind of thing as when they say that tables exist. So in that sense, like tables exist, the sentence tables exist is not that different from there's milk in the fridge, right? Because that sentence is just there's milk which exists, which is in a fridge that exists. Right. So I don't know if it's true that people think that these are very, very different things. In some ways, that's a result of analysis.
That's an empirical question, right?
Sure.
So like, is it the case? We could just ask people, like, and I would suggest maybe not like people in North America. If you ask that question, they may have very strong opinions that these are not the same thing.
Yeah.
We don't have to agree with them.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we don't agree with them. Yeah.
Okay. Someone else should talk.
David.
Hi. Maybe I can just come back to the supernatural. I'm not particularly bothered by this myself, but other people are, and I'm occasionally asked about it, and so I think it's worth having a better answer than I'm generally able to provide. Konrad, you cited, I think it was Draper, who suggested this supernatural was what is not natural but can have an effect on nature, or it's not part of nature but can have an effect. Well, that just strikes me as being entirely unsatisfactory, because we're just saying, in effect, that we know what nature is, which we don't. I mean, the whole problem is that there might be people who say there are these spiritual forces at work, they're natural spiritual forces, they are part of nature, and so the difficulty is in distinguishing those entities or forces from what we believe is nature. Now, I think one can take a kind of Popperian view and say we think of the natural or what's pertaining to nature as being what's testable, and I'm generally okay with that, but as I say, I do get challenged on occasion by people saying, well, how can we even define what's supernatural? Aren't there people around who just believe that these forces are natural, and so you're imposing your Western categories on
Absolutely, right? I mean, these categories, these concepts have a history, right, which goes back to a particular point in time. But of course, that doesn't mean that there's nothing to them, right? I mean, we don't want to be, relativists of that sort, I imagine. Right? But on the other hand, I definitely see the issues, right? And in fact, what I said later about these things ending up being fairly tautological was my way of getting at that point, right? So people who say it's problematic, I agree with it. And I mean, the testability, which is another way, well, that's problematic also, because a lot of supernatural claims, sort of the kinds of claims which would most likely call magical or superstitious or whatever, they're perfectly testable. They've been tested and they've been found false, right? So, I don't have an altogether good answer, right? That's why I didn't say I have a definition. But I do think that what's important is that we do think about the processes that lead to people having certain kinds of beliefs, and that there's a fundamental difference between the processes that lead to supernatural beliefs, what we have been calling supernatural beliefs, and to scientific beliefs, and that understanding the differences in the processes will give us a lot of insight into what those categories are about, right?
As it happens, cognitive scientists of religion think that we have solved this problem satisfactorily, which I will tell you about for a small fee. So I think one option is to psychologize the category, right? Is to get rid of the metaphysics. Okay, let's forget about the nature-supernature distinction at a metaphysical level, and just think about the psychology of nature and supernature. So one of the things that evolutionary sort of psychology types say about supernatural beliefs is that a supernatural belief is just one that violates our intuitive expectations, to the extent that those intuitive expectations are generated by kind of like deep evolutionary intuitions.
And that's not a good answer.
Right. So right, yeah. So like, and then you worry about whether or not that picture of the evolution of the mind is reasonable. Blah blah blah. But as a general tendency to like psychologize the question rather than to kind of think of it metaphysically, like might not be a bad way to go.
Yeah. I mean, the issue with that definition is that scientific concepts break our intuitions all the time. I mean, this is hardly novel of me to be saying that. That's Bob Macaulay's point.
And then you just have to bite that bullet. Yeah, exactly. So like quantum theory violates your intuitive expectations. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And to that extent, it's supernatural belief.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Paul Draper cares about that, but the rest of us don't. I mean, I think. Yeah.
I think Abby had a question.
Yeah, thank you. I hate to throw cold water on this, but my brain kind of stopped and froze way back when you were quoting David Hume. I find it really difficult to do that nowadays for obvious reasons. The decolonization movement's really strong, certainly in the UK. So, at the University of Edinburgh, when they rename buildings because of Hume's racist ideas, and SOAS, and places won't quote him. So, not a bad definition, not a bad discussion to start with, miracles are a violation of the law of nature. But is there any way we can work around this without having to quote Hume? As the same way that I don't quote Malinowski anymore, as most anthropologists would find that difficult, because of their, again, great ideas about ethnography, great ideas about functionalism, but unfortunately, the revelation of his diaries made him very problematic. So as a scholar of religion and somebody who's been very involved in the decolonization movement and published recently quite a lot about it, it's a sincere question. Is there somebody else? Is there another philosopher that we can look to other than those who are being so discredited nowadays?
Can we just bracket all that?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, they're all, it's kind of like, who is more problematic? Like,
Yeah.
You go with Tyler. Tyler is also like moderately racist. You go with Fontenelle. Fontenelle is a bit dumber than Hume, so like I don't know if that's, I don't know, like. I think at some point we just have to go, look, like all these people are problematic, and like unless we want to detach ourselves from the tradition, from the conversation altogether, like I don't know if it is avoidable that like to cite Hume. I'm not sure it's plausible.
Sometimes we have to discuss something differently, because the creation of certain categories have emerged from people, from thinking like Hume and other people, and definitions of religion have emerged as well.
Sure.
Some of those have been really deeply embedded in quite problematic history. So I think it's actually part of our job. I don't know how to do it in some ways. So sometimes I come across those sorts of discussions and think, yeah, but who else was talking about those things? And is there a way that we could talk about them without re-embedding Hume in our curriculum?
Yeah.
You don't have to talk about it.
Yeah, I guess we could just assert the definition without showing pictures of Hume. I don't know. Yeah.
What about with him with a nappy on his head? What about with him with a nappy on his head? Does that solve the issue partly?
Well, yes, because again, okay, he's a white guy. I don't know what he was doing with that. But if it was somebody, a person of color, of course, we wouldn't have said that.
Yeah.
No, look, I mean, I take your point, and what I think is good is that we no longer treat intellectual figures who have a fundamental role in our culture as these, knights in white armor. We recognize that they were people who were highly problematic in many cases, right? And I think it's important in our discussions of our field and the history of our field to have an awareness of that. But I guess I wouldn't. Two things. I don't see a way of just moving away from discussion of Hume and his concepts straightforwardly like that. And what I would perhaps argue more for is that the kinds of figures that have been ignored because they weren't white males, essentially, right? It would be great, and it is being done, that these are being brought back into the conversation, right? I mean, when I was doing my PhD at Monash, a number of the other people in my department were working on bringing historical female philosophers back into the conversation. And that's great, because these figures were being ignored, right? Similarly, in the case of anthropologists, very often you had local collaborators who played an enormous role in the research, who are now being brought back into the conversation. And that's great, right? So I suppose in between tearing down the statues that we've put up, very highly unrealistic statues of certain figures, and including other figures in the conversation, I think that at this stage, from my point of view, which again, of course, is limited, right, for obvious reasons, that seems like the right thing to be doing right now. I don't see a way of just excluding Hume out of the conversation.
I guess there's a way to critically evaluate what he said and somehow square the circle, and David was right to raise this earlier, that of course many people are saying, what do you mean by a law of nature, right? What does Hume mean by a law of nature? And is the fact that he thought that, as he called them Negroes, were biologically inferior, as he would say, a law of nature? Perhaps there's also reason to critique his definition that miracles are a law of nature. So here's somebody who comes around with an idea there is such a thing as a law of nature, but we could critique him by saying, exactly what did he mean by law? Exactly what did he mean by nature?
Sure.
And looking at his racist comments, then we have more of a critique, and therefore a critique.
And that's much more rounded discussion of his definition and his ideas about the definition. Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah.
So in a not dissimilar stream, is part of the problem here with how we define supernatural that we keep defining it against science right? So, we treat science as a natural category when it's clearly not, right? So science, there's a history of science, we understand when it started, we understand the process of falsification, we know all of this. So treating it like a natural kind in the way that we would treat maybe something like supernatural beliefs or religion is just very strange, and yet it is kind of the foundation of all of these arguments,
no,
right?
I think we totally agree with this.
Like saying, well, there's all these things of science that violate our intuitions, it's like, that's true, but that's not really, that doesn't change the fact that, like, for, thousands and thousands of years, none of that stuff existed
Look, I completely agree with you, right? Because the distinction between the supernatural and natural sort of seems to invite the conclusion, okay, so there are natural beliefs and supernatural beliefs. Everything's one or the other, right? Whereas, if you think about the processes that underlie these things, you go, okay, so you have a particular kind of cognitive and social set of processes that produce what we like to think of as supernatural beliefs, then another set which produces what we like to think of as natural processes. We have natural beliefs, right? Then we have other processes, such as common sense or whatever, which also produces sets of beliefs which are actually different from either of those two, right? Once you start thinking about that side of things, the dichotomy gets broken down, and I think you get a lot more insight. So yeah, I don't like the dichotomy, definitely.
Yeah, and in some ways, I think if researchers begin thinking about, I don't know, like superstrings. I think how lots of scientists think about superstrings is as like natural objects that it may or may not be salutary to believe in or something like this. Whereas ghosts, well, clearly that's spooky. Like to the extent that like psychological scientists, social scientists begin challenging that particular assumption, right? That hypothetical scientific entities are salutary to believe in, and then like ghosts are spooky and irrational to believe in. Like that's not a bad thing, right? To challenge the kind of like the way the line is currently drawn. I mean, I think one way to describe Paul Draper's definition is basically definition by ceding authority to physicists who are overwhelmingly Anglo-American, European, and male. Right, so like, because his definition of nature is basically the things that physicists study, right, and that surely is socially problematic.
Whoops,
that's scary.
Sorry. Hold on. I've got. Okay.
Yes,
I had the thing open, unfortunately, in one.
What, Gmail?
There it is.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
So I need my next talk.
I'm trying to get...
you have like a million tabs open. It's terrifying.
I have a million tabs open, yes. Sorry, I need to sit down over here.
Okay.
Keep answering while I stuff about and put your next talk on the board. Keep talking among yourselves.
So
please.
yeah, I mean, like I have a couple projects where we code data for supernatural content. So I've done this a lot, and this is a situation where you do actually have to define what supernatural means to make this an effective thing. Sure. And we run into this problem all the time where you look at it's very difficult to find a definition of supernatural that isn't contrasted with science, and that's like if we're coding folk medicine from the 1930s, which we've done, like science doesn't even factor into it, right? Like the things that are natural are still largely ineffective and like just very much culturally transmitted sort of processes. So we end up defining it based on what would be kind of more intuitive basis, right? So if you put an ointment on your arm, or you consume something, or like these sort of processes where you're looking at like touch and like consumption, those things are natural. And then if you're looking at processes like going to a special place on a Friday and putting a snail on a thorn and letting it shrivel, that becomes like there's no clear causal processes, intuitive causal processes that would make that natural. But the definitions become really tricky still. But it's like, I think that when we so many of the kind of examples of how it's difficult to define supernatural, to get rid of things, are things that are sort of like very culturally specific, scientific revolutions type stuff, which is interesting for other reasons, but maybe not in like how people psychologically think about natural and supernatural kinds, because it's just such a recent phenomenon in human history.
Right, yeah. And you know, like lots of people in this room study something like souls, like beliefs in souls, right? It's a kind of intuitive dualism. There's nothing counterintuitive about that at all, right? Like so the MCI definition of the supernatural really doesn't apply for things like intuitive dualisms. Yeah, exactly.
Agents and minds and souls and most of it.
All right, everyone, we've run a bit over time, so I think we should be getting on to the next topic.